My head's still spinning because I think we talk a lot about how a lot of the jobs that exist today were not there, as you say, 10 years ago. For example, you start the conversation by saying that we have to start thinking broader. How do we do that from an investment perspective?
Well, from my perspective, I think it is about recognizing a more integrated global economy, that the nature of economic activity has shifted. So we have global companies that operate locally. I mean, I work for one, for goodness sake. UBS is a Swiss bank. Yes, well, our chairman is German. Our official language is English. Most of the board aren't Swiss. Our investment bank is headquartered in London. You know, I'm the chief economist, and I basically live in economy class on a plane somewhere. Shareholder value again. So, you know, to what extent are we Swiss anymore? We have a Swiss culture, but we also have a global culture. And so I think we've got to recognize that accessing an economy with a lot of change and with a far broader range of issues requires us to perhaps look a little bit beyond our comfort zone, to understand that if we want to access a rapidly changing world, we need to look as broadly as possible. And I would be the first to admit it's not easy to do, but I think that that's important.
You mentioned globalization, you mentioned how an increasingly interconnected world. That was another topic at the World Economic Forum as well, around the growing protectionism that we're starting to see around the globe. How is that influencing these developments that we're talking about?
One of the issues that comes out of the fourth industrial revolution is that there is a group in society that is left behind. And there are some fairly common characteristics to this. It doesn't matter whether you're looking at France or the US or the UK or Japan. The group that tends to suffer economically tend to be male. They tend to be older, typically over 55. They tend to be low income. They tend to be less well educated. And they also tend to be rural rather than urban. But this group has become a lot more vocal in politics, and we've descended into what I call scapegoat economics, that this group know that they've been left behind, they know that they have suffered, and they want someone to blame. It's a natural response. And so who is it easy to blame? So, well, it's not my fault I've lost my job, it's not my fault my income is low, which is an understandable response. It must be the fault of the foreigner. It's that Mexican, he's stolen my job, or it's that Polish person who's come down and driven out wages. Now, this is wrong. It's not the fault of the foreigner, unless they're French, obviously. It's always the fault of the French. But you end up with this environment where you very naturally get a political movement in favor of protectionism. The counter-argument to that is, you know, economists need to do, frankly, a better job, I think, of explaining it's not foreigners' fault. We haven't done a good job of that so far. But also the localization that I talked about perhaps offers some hope that even if protectionist barriers continue to go up, and they are going up today, the fact that we are able to produce more locally reduces the damage in the long term. Now, over the next 10 years, protectionism is an undoubted negative, but it's a negative that will diminish in impact. It will still be a net negative, but it will diminish in impact over time as we allow technology to create a more localized economy, I think.
All right, Riaan, I don't think there's a day that goes by in this country that you don't see a headline that says, go invest offshore, go global, and so on, you know, diversify geographically. How do you make those decisions in this fractured world, increasingly fractured world?
You know, investing at its core is identifying an opportunity, a company that's able to grow its internal money-making capability. And if you're able to do this with some sustainability, you're called a high-quality company. And it doesn't matter where you look, there's two things that are critical. The first one is you must be able to protect your money-making capability. It doesn't really matter which industry you operate in. You must be able to protect it. And there's a few ways you can do that. We, by the way, call it an economic moat or competitive advantage. But there's a few ways you can do that. You can have a strong portfolio of brands or a strong brand which gives you pricing power, similar to Paul's point. Or you can have a very entrenched position within an industry that is apt to grow. That brings us to the second point, which is you need to be able to grow your ability to make money, because that's what investing is. You need to be able to grow your potential profit pool. And we work very closely with Paul and his team and with UBS in identifying various trends and themes around the world and what's changing within the global economy. An example could be an aging population within especially developed markets, or urbanization and a rising income within developing markets. So in essence, what I'm saying is find companies that are able to protect their money-making capability or their profit or revenue or what other accounting principle you want to give it, and that's able to grow that potential.
Now, talking about, areas and opportunities, not too long ago, BRICS was the in thing. We were so excited to be part of the club until you started to see the growth, stagnating in many of those particular countries. And I think we're probably the worst performer in the group, possibly, or the second worst performer in the group. So when you look at jurisdictions, you look at opportunities, how do you identify them today?
Sure, that's a good question. So we tend to invest in multinational companies that operate in various jurisdictions. We are seeing a few opportunities. We don't think globally markets are in bubble territory, although returns might be lower than what we've become used to post the GFC, the Great Financial Recession. We're seeing opportunities in Europe, especially in the periphery. I don't know if Paul agrees. We're seeing opportunities in a few Asian economies, and we're also starting to see a turnaround in a few South American economies. In terms of areas to avoid, what we tend to do, unless we're really comfortable with a company's governance, we would rather invest in a multinational company expanding into emerging markets where we feel the growth is going to come from and where we see growth coming forward without taking unnecessarily risk we won't be compensated for.
Duncan, we've talked about the changing world and how things have evolved over the past few years, how today is completely different to 2007 when the first iPhone came out, for example. You've been investing for clients for over a decade. What lessons have you learned in that time?
Oh, well, we've had exchange controls for almost 30 years, from 1968 to 1997, roughly. And we still have exchange controls, of course, but now we're allowed to invest anywhere in the world, at least to some extent. And to me, the biggest change has been all the various opportunities you find in international markets, all the various companies you can consider, all the various industries and so on. Don't get me wrong, we've got world-class companies listed on the JSE, but you're limited for choice. And you almost invest via a process of elimination more than anything else. And offshore, it's a different ballgame. You're virtually spoiled for choice. You can invest in robotics, you can invest in Internet of Things, biotechnology, you can invest in, well, virtually anything. And the biggest lesson I've learned is quite simply that things happen, they change, consumer behaviorism changes, technology changes. And when that sort of trend starts, you've got to adapt very, very quickly. And so, in short, you've got to keep an eye on your investment and make sure, that you're not caught unawares when a big trend actually does change.
Yeah. You use the C word, choice. It's a big world out there. What sort of questions should an investor ask themselves when they are deciding where to go? As you say, there are multiple companies all over the globe, multiple asset classes. How do you choose?
That's a big thing, isn't it? Well, I think to link up with what Riaan has been saying is you got to look at the type of company, and the big thing always to me as a starting point is sustainability. So whatever company you invest in, you must of course do your homework first and make sure it's got a very strong balance sheet and it's got superb management, and as Warren Buffett also has said from time to time, it's got honest management. So that's basically how you make your choice. You actually stick with the winners, the companies, the boards, the type of companies and industries where the management tend to make things happen instead of just waiting for things to happen to them.
Okay. Let me check if there are any questions from the floor in the meantime. Going once. I can't see anything in this middle. There's one there.
A bit more local question. What impact do you see the fourth industrial revolution have on Africa as a continent?
From my side, and you guys know the local market far better than I, but from the top down, mixed. The typical economics answer on the one hand, on the other. So the positives are this is a resource-rich continent. We may be trading less in terms of finished product in the future, but you can't 3D print a bar of gold. Believe me, if you could, UBS would be doing it, but you can't. So resources are still going to be traded, and we've got another 2 billion people joining the planet over the course of the next 30 years. You know what? They want the same standard of living that the rest of us enjoy. That's going to lead to resource demand. Aspects of the service industry. The tourism is something which is becoming more and more a product that is being demanded, particularly in the younger generation. Experience rather than possessions is how the younger generation is spending money. Again, that's something that Africa can offer. Africa has a huge pool of talent with its population. I would suggest that Africa has failed to maximize the human capital at its disposal. And that is the challenge, I think. Now, I'm not saying that this won't happen. A company or a country or a continent can turn around their education experience within a generation very easily. But I would say that is Africa's challenge, is to maximize the huge potential that's there and which perhaps is being wasted in some ways at the moment.
Anyone want to add on the local front?
Yeah, I just want to add a small comment. Basically, is Africa is fairly inaccessible for those of you who have ever tried to go camping somewhere in Africa. There's a reason why they talk about darkest Africa, and it's actually, I think, the lack of infrastructure generally. But if you just look at a new technology like cell phone applications, and how quickly that's been adopted by the entire continent, to example, transfer money or to use in all kinds of other things.
In fact, I want to talk a little bit about that, the leapfrogging of some of the technologies that have been out there, particularly for developing countries such as ourselves. So, for example, there are more mobile phones on the continent than there are landline because we had to do that leapfrog. The investment in infrastructure would have been ridiculous. Will there be opportunities then with the fourth industrial revolution for us to leapfrog quite a bit of some of the infrastructure needs that we will need, that we have?
Well, I think this applies to a number of countries around the world, but Africa in particular. There is the potential to leapfrog. There is, however, also a danger with infrastructure. And the danger with infrastructure is that very often infrastructure is politically guided. And this is a general comment, but politicians tend to drive policy by using the rear view mirror. They're trying to preserve the past, and this is what we've done, therefore we need to carry on with this, and not necessarily adapt the infrastructure. So I think there is the potential to leapfrog, but there is a danger that we will end up putting in place obsolete infrastructure. Now, China actually provides a good example of this, that as you may recall, China had some very severe power shortages 10 years ago. Shanghai, every hotel used to have a diesel generator because the power would be cut out. So China very understandably invested heavily in oil and gas-fired power stations. They built well over 100 of these things. Most of them will have to close now. And they will have to close because China forgot that you need water to cool an oil or a gas-fired power station. And they don't have enough water to cool these power stations down. So they've now got to close them. So what we had here was a political decision, which was we need infrastructure, which was perfectly right, but what they should have been, perhaps in my view, doing was investing in solar panels in cities, not in coal-fired power stations in an area where there is no water. And it's an example of the danger of failing to leapfrog properly. And you all know, if you fail to leapfrog properly, you fall flat on your face.
Maybe just to add, I think it's important that, to your question, sir, you don't have to link your economic or your wealth or your economy to Africa's. I think that's what we're saying is, I think we, for the first time ever, we can go and find opportunity wherever it is. Should it come back to Africa, we will follow, and there will be enough warning signs, and we'll know soon enough. But yeah, I think that we'll rather buy the companies selling the shovels, in this case the guys building the infrastructure, which will be German or Chinese or maybe even US infrastructure companies coming to Africa, the guys that provide the IP, because that's normally where, once again, the money is made, in the shorter term, at least.
And talking about China, is that still a viable place to park your money?
In the sort of medium term, we are still bullish on China. I think the concern with China, and there's a few things we're watching closely. The first one is to make sure that China doesn't become old before it becomes rich. And that's something, because of their current demographics and because of how the economy developed with the one-child policy, that is something to actively watch. Because what you find in China is the typical household has sort of a V-shaped structure where the child supports the two parents, and the grandparents, and so on. So that's something we watch very closely. But at the moment, there's still by far enough discretionary spend, which is very important for us. The second thing that we are what we watch closely, but we're not as concerned about, and Paul might like to add, is China's current debt situation. Their debt is around 300% of GDP, which is high by any emerging markets, right? But it's mostly internal. It's mostly between parastatal companies. So what will happen is, should you default, most likely the other guys will just bail you out for by 110% of your company, similar to the SA model. So yeah, those are the things we're watching, but the growth is still there, and we still see for the foreseeable future around 6.5% or around trend growth.
Paul, want to add on China?
I'd agree on the debt side. I think the one thing you must always ask when you're contemplating any country's debt is, who do you owe the money to? If you owe the money domestically, it's simply a transfer of wealth from one generation to another, or one group in society to another. If you owe it internationally, it's different. So the reason Greece had a debt crisis in Europe and Italy didn't, they both started out with the same debt. But the Italian government owed money to Italians, and the Greeks owed money to the Germans. And the one thing you learn in this life is never owe money to the Germans. They want it back at some point. And that's why you had the crisis there. So I think that's an important point. I have an additional metric which causes me a little bit of concern in China. Since 1995, when China began its process of entering the World Trade Organization, Chinese who went to study overseas returned to China. That, in the last 2 years, has stopped happening. Now, that is a worrying signal if it continues, because this is the best and the brightest. They've had a good quality education overseas, and if they don't see a future for themselves in China, that is what an economist would call a signaling effect. It's telling me that there's something wrong with the system. Now, I'm not going to take 2 years' worth of data and say this is a 20-year trend. That's not what we should be doing, but I think that's something to watch quite closely.
All right, I'm going to take one final question, if there is one from the floor, as we're about to wrap up. Any other questions? I have these lights in my eyes, I can't quite see. All right, so let's wrap up a little bit, and I want to bring in a bit of politics, because the world out there is a little bit scary at the moment. It seems that North Korea and our good friend Donald Trump in the United States are playing chicken with each other, possibly at our expense. And that has a direct impact on markets. And we've lived through some huge volatility over the past few years. That game of chicken that's taking place politically, what impact do you see that having on market volatility?
Well, in the short term, I'm going to start and you're going to finish. In the short term, you'll definitely see a pickup in volatility. I think that, and Paul and I discussed this before, and then their house view is basically, and I'm sure you'll elaborate, but their view is that they don't really see a conflict escalating beyond what it's at the moment, and we tend to share that view. A pickup in volatility because of political reasons is normally a good buying opportunity. So, yeah, we are watching it very closely. Sorry, Paul.
No. I mean, obviously, I work for a Swiss company. We are Swiss and therefore neutral on everything. Yeah. So I think a couple of points about this. The first is that human beings are genetically programmed to be optimistic. This is a biological fact, because otherwise you will never take risks. So any human, except for the Scots, is programmed to be optimistic. What that means is people will not price in a tail risk of conventional nuclear war in the Korean Peninsula. You will not see the markets price a 10% chance of war. Markets will only price war when war happens, and we don't think war happens. So what that means is that there is a limit to what we see. What I am more concerned about with the current developments is that President Trump appears, in my view, to be using the Korean situation as a reason to increase trade pressure on China. This comment that we will stop doing trade with China, which is not a particularly credible threat, if they don't apply pressure to Korea. Well, we may not get that, but we might get something. We might get an escalation of tariffs. Now that is a risk that markets can price in, because that's not an extreme disaster, we can't possibly contemplate it type risk. So I think there is a risk that markets will price that in. Generally speaking, when we get events like this, I think that there are a couple of points to bear in mind. The first is politicians do not matter as much as they think they do. In the short term, me as an economist, what I'm looking for is the answer to two questions. Do I have a job? Can I afford to buy what I want to buy? And actually, a lot of the time, politicians don't have a big impact on those two questions in the short term. And this noise and this geopolitics is not likely to change the answer to those two questions. The second thing is to remember, I think, that markets do exhibit volatility in immediate short-term response to things like this. But actually, investors become pretty pragmatic pretty quickly. If you want to think about the risk of geopolitics to an economy and to a market, I suggest you get a chart of the Israeli shekel exchange rate. If there was anything on the planet that is going to react to geopolitical risk, it would be the Israeli shekel. Flat as a pancake. It doesn't react. And I suspect that we'll get a lot of noise, we'll get a lot of bluster, and I am concerned on the trade side. But I wouldn't be looking for disaster scenarios.
All right. Final word, Duncan. Let's get a sense for new investors entering this uncertain world. What advice would you give them? People who are just starting out, yeah.
Somebody who hasn't invested yet.
Someone who's just kind of started, who has not lived through the ups and downs that we've seen.
But my advice would be very simple. It's just to start. Go and see your investment professional, make the appointment, talk it through, think about what you want to achieve, and then start. But also, as with example, a race or a marathon or practicing for it, you've got to see it through. You've got to keep at it. And don't ever underestimate the enormous power of compounded returns. So the big thing is simply start.
And close your ears to the noise, right?
That's it, yeah.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much to all three of you. Let's give them a round of applause.